The note was taped to my daughter's bedroom door at eye level, where they knew I couldn't miss it. Temporary order of custody granted. Lily Brooks to reside with father pending review. I read it 3 times standing in the hallway, still in my scrubs, the smell of the hospital still on my skin. Then I opened the door, and the room was empty. Not messy. Not lived in, empty. The little bed was stripped to the mattress. The stuffed rabbit she could not sleep without was gone from the shelf. The nightlight we picked out together was unplugged and missing, leaving a pale square on the wall where the dust hadn't gathered. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A voicemail. I already knew the voice before I pressed play. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Natalie. You should have signed when my mother asked. She always told you the family wins. Then a small laugh, almost gentle, the kind he used at dinner parties. The kind everyone loved. The line went dead. I sat down on the bare mattress because my legs simply stopped holding me. I remember the sound the springs made in the quiet, a single tired creak, and how loud it was in a room that used to be full of breathing and bedtime questions. I remember thinking that someone had walked through my home, folded my child's clothes, and carried her out the door while I was 40 minutes away pressing a cold cloth to a stranger's feverish forehead. I had spent the night caring for someone else's child, and somewhere across the city, my own was falling asleep in a house where I was the villain of a story I had never been allowed to read. I didn't cry. Not then. I think I was too far past it. The way a wound can be so deep it doesn't hurt for the first few seconds. I just held that paper, official and cold, stamped by a court that had decided who I was without ever meeting me. A judge had looked at pages of careful lies and signed his name. And I, a woman who had built her entire life around being responsible, being dependable, being the one you could count on, had been declared a danger to my own daughter. My name is Natalie Brooks. I am 34 years old, and I live in Columbus, Ohio, in a small 2-bedroom house with a crooked porch step I kept meaning to fix. I am a pediatric nurse. I work nights, mostly holding the hands of children who are frightened and sick at 3 in the morning, telling their parents it's going to be okay, learning how to stay calm when everything inside me wants to fall apart. I am good at my job. I have been told I am gentle, that I notice things other people miss, that children trust me. For 8 years I believed that being good at caring for people was the same as being safe. I believed that the world kept a record of who tried hard and who told the truth, and that the record would protect me when it mattered. I want to tell you about the woman I was before that night, because she was so certain. She paid her bills on time. She kept folders of every important paper, labeled and dated, because that was just how her mind worked. She forgave more than she should have. She made excuses for people who never made any for her. She thought that if she just kept being patient, kept being decent, the people who were supposed to love her would eventually see her clearly. That woman trusted the system. That woman trusted the family she had married into. And that woman was sitting on a stripped mattress in an empty room, finally understanding that none of it had ever been mutual. Before I take you any further into this, I want to stop for a moment, because I imagine some of you are listening to this in a kitchen, or a car, or lying awake the way I used to, and I'd like to know who you are. Tell me where you're listening from today. Are you in the United States, in Canada, the UK, South Africa, the Philippines, Nigeria, Australia, or somewhere I've never been but would love to picture while I tell you this? And tell me honestly, have you ever been the person everyone called when they needed something, but somehow forgot when you were the one who needed holding? Have you ever been treated like the useful one in the family instead of the loved one? If you have, write your country and a little of your story in the comments. I read them. I really do try to reply, because I know what it feels like to tell the truth into a room and have no one answer. And if a story like this makes you feel a little less alone tonight, stay with me and subscribe, because what happened next is the reason I'm still able to tell you any of this at all. So let me take you back to that mattress, because that is where the woman I used to be ended, and someone quieter and far more dangerous began. I sat there a long time. The streetlight came through the blinds in thin gold lines across the floor, the way it had every night Lily slept in that room, and I kept staring at the spot where her nightlight used to glow. I thought about her asking me, just a week before, why the moon followed the car. I thought about the gap in her front teeth, and how she'd started covering her mouth when she laughed because a girl at school told her it looked funny. I thought about how she still reached for my hand in parking lots without looking, certain it would be there. And then I thought about her reaching for it tonight, in a strange bed, in Daniel's mother's enormous quiet house, and finding nothing. That was the moment something in my chest turned to iron. I want to be honest with you about Daniel, because the easy thing would be to make him a monster from the first line, and he wasn't. That's what made it work. Daniel Hale was charming in a way that made waiters remember him and strangers trust him within minutes. He had a warm, unhurried laugh and a habit of touching your arm when he spoke, like whatever you were saying was the only thing in the world that mattered. In public, he was the husband other women smiled at me about. "You're so lucky," they'd say. And for a while, standing in his light, I let myself believe I was. But I had also seen the other Daniel. The one who went cold and quiet when a bill arrived. The one who let his mother speak to me like staff, and then told me I was too sensitive when I flinched. The one who, in the last year of our marriage, started watching me the way you watch someone you're building a case against. I didn't understand it then. I thought we were just unhappy. I did not understand that unhappiness, in that family, was not an ending. It was a strategy. And his mother, Vivian. I'll tell you more about her, because you'll need to understand her to understand all of it. But for now, know this. The last real conversation I'd had with Vivian, weeks before that night, she had set down her teacup very precisely and looked at me with a kindness that didn't reach her eyes, and she'd said, "A nurse who works nights can't really keep a child, can she, dear? It's nothing personal. It's just how these things look." I had thought it was a cruel thing to say. I had not understood it was a preview. Sitting in that empty room, her words came back to me, and for the first time I heard them correctly. Not as an insult. As a plan she had already set in motion. It's just how these things look. She had been talking about a courtroom. She had been talking about exactly this. I stood up. My knees ached. The paper was still in my hand, soft now from being held too tightly. I walked through my small house, turning on every light, as if light could undo what the dark had taken. And in the kitchen, on the counter where I always dropped my keys, I saw the thing that finally broke the stillness in me. A single drawing. Lily's. A crayon picture of the two of us holding hands outside our crooked little house. The sun a fat yellow scribble in the corner. She'd left it there that morning before school, before any of this, when she still thought she was coming home. I picked it up, and my hands started shaking, and I finally cried. The way you cry when no one is there to see it and there's no reason left to be strong. But here is the thing I want you to understand, the thing they never understood about me. They thought they had taken everything when they took Lily. They thought a stripped bed and a court stamp and a smug little voicemail would be the end of me, that I would crumble the way quiet, agreeable women are supposed to crumble. They had spent a year building a story about a woman who couldn't cope. They were so busy writing it that they never once stopped to ask what a woman who notices everything, documents everything, and keeps every folder labeled and dated might be quietly holding on to. I had believed the truth would protect me. I had been wrong about that. But I was about to learn something they had never counted on. The truth doesn't protect you on its own. You have to be willing to fight for it, slowly, patiently, with proof in your hand and no one in your corner. And I was, at last, willing. I folded Lily's drawing and put it in the inside pocket of my bag over my heart, where I would carry it through everything that came next. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, pulled out a notebook, and on the first clean page I wrote down the date, the time I'd come home, and every word of the voicemail Daniel had left me, exactly as he'd said it. He thought he'd left me a taunt. He had no idea he'd just handed me the first page of the file that would one day take everything from him. To understand how a man can carry a sleeping child out of her own home and feel righteous about it, you have to go back to the beginning, to a time when I would have sworn to you that Daniel Hale was the kindest person I had ever met. I need you to see him the way I saw him, because if you only see the ending, you'll think I was a fool. And maybe I was. But I want you to understand it was the kind of foolishness that comes from wanting, very badly, to be loved by people who were very good at performing love. I met Daniel at the hospital, of all places. He'd come in with his mother after she'd taken a fall, nothing serious, a sprained wrist, but the way he hovered over her, the way he charmed every nurse on the floor, I noticed him before he ever noticed me. When he finally did, he looked at me like I was the only competent person in a building full of professionals. "You're the only one who's actually told us anything straight," he said, and he smiled, and I felt it in my chest like sunlight. I was 26. I had spent my whole life being the dependable one, the one people relied on but rarely chose. And here was this warm, easy man choosing me, looking at me like I was something rare. His family had money. Old money, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself, but is in everything: the car, the watch, the way restaurants suddenly had a table. Vivian Hale was gracious to me at first, in that practiced way that I mistook for warmth. She held charity luncheons. She had a wing of the children's hospital named after her late husband. People in Columbus spoke her name carefully, with respect. When she took my hand at our first dinner and said, "Daniel has told me so much about his little nurse," I heard affection. It took me years to hear what was actually in those words. His little nurse. A description and a ranking, delivered in the same breath. I want to tell you about the red flags, because there were red flags, and I want to be honest about the fact that I saw them and explained them away. That's what we do, isn't it? When we want something to be true, we become lawyers for the people hurting us. The first one came 3 weeks after we married. Daniel sat me down with a calm, reasonable expression and explained how the household finances would work. His family had an arrangement, he said. The accounts were structured a certain way. It would be simpler if my salary went toward the day-to-day, the groceries, the utilities, Lily's things later on, and the family money handled the rest. It sounded sensible. It sounded almost generous. It took me years to understand what it actually meant. It meant that everything I earned disappeared into the running of a life, leaving no trace, while everything that carried the Hale name stayed locked behind doors I was never given keys to. On paper, in any record anyone might one day pull, I would look like a woman who contributed nothing. He didn't say that part. He didn't have to. I think, even then, some quiet part of him was already keeping score for a game I didn't know we were playing. The second flag was Vivian. She had a gift for cruelty that left no fingerprints. At a family gathering, with a dozen people listening, she'd say, "Natalie's so wonderfully practical. Not everyone can be decorative." And everyone would laugh, and I'd laugh too, my face hot, because what else do you do? Once, when I wore a dress I'd saved for, she touched the fabric between 2 fingers and said, "How clever, finding something like this," and let it drop. In front of guests she called me family. In the kitchen, when it was just the two of us, she called me the help with a ring, and smiled when she said it, daring me to be offended by a joke. I told myself she was from a different generation. I told myself it didn't matter what she thought, because Daniel loved me, and for a while in his way, I think he did. Or he loved how I made him look. He loved having a wife who handled the things he found tedious, who remembered the birthdays and managed the appointments and never embarrassed him. I was useful. I was so very useful. And I confused being needed with being cherished, the way I imagine some of you listening have done at least once in your lives, because that confusion is the oldest trick the people who use us ever play. Then Lily came, and for a while everything else went quiet. I want you to know that whatever else broke in that marriage, my daughter was never a mistake or a regret. From the first night, in the dark of the hospital room with her tiny fist closed around my finger, I understood something I had never understood before, that I could love someone enough to set my whole life on fire, and call it warmth. I was the one who woke for the night feedings. I was the one who learned the rhythm of her fevers and her dreams. Daniel adored her the way he adored most things, brightly and from a comfortable distance, swooping in for the photographs and the bedtime stories he chose to tell, absent for the long, dull, sacred work of actually raising a child. And here is a detail I held on to, though I didn't know yet why it mattered. In those years I kept everything. Receipts for her clothes and her medicine, the pediatrician's after-hours notes, the school forms, the records of every payment I made for her life. Not because I was building a case. I wasn't that clever then. I kept them because I had always kept things, because some part of me, raised to feel I had to prove my worth, never quite trusted that anyone would take my word for what I gave. It was a wound, that habit. It was also, though I couldn't have known it then, the only armor I would have left. The marriage didn't end in an explosion. It eroded, the way a coastline does, so slowly you don't notice the ground is gone until you're standing in the water. Daniel grew distant, then cold, then careless about hiding it. He started staying late, then staying gone. Vivian's comments sharpened. And there was a new note in how they both treated me, a kind of patience, as if they were waiting for something, as if a decision had been made in a room I wasn't allowed into. I remember standing at my kitchen sink one evening, watching Lily color at the table, the same crayons, the same fat yellow sun she always drew, and feeling a cold thread of fear I couldn't name. I told myself it was just exhaustion. I told myself unhappy marriages were normal, that we'd find our way through. I didn't understand yet that you cannot find your way through with people who have already decided you are something to be removed. I didn't understand that the smiles at the dinner table and the warmth in front of guests had never been the truth. Only the costume the truth wore in public. I would understand it soon enough. But first, the woman who still believed her marriage was merely failing was about to discover exactly what her husband and his mother had been so patiently waiting for. I found out about the affair the way the practical, useful wife always finds out, by accident, while doing something thoughtful. I was returning Daniel's jacket to the hall closet, because I was the one who hung up his jackets, and his phone slid out of the pocket and lit up on the floor. I wasn't snooping. I want you to know that, because it matters to how the rest unfolded. I bent to pick it up, and the screen was already glowing with a message I didn't go looking for. A name I didn't recognize. Words I won't repeat, because they weren't even the cruel part. The cruel part was how ordinary they were. The easy familiarity. The plans for a weekend I'd been told was a business trip. The casual mention of, after all this is sorted. After all this is sorted. I stood in my own hallway holding my husband's phone, and that phrase lodged in me like a splinter. Sorted. As if I were a problem on a list. As if there were a plan and I was a step in it. I didn't scream. I think the women who use us count on us to scream, to rage, to do something messy they can point to later. I set the phone down on the table exactly where he'd find it, and I sat in the dark kitchen and waited. When he came home I told him I knew. I expected denial, or anger, or at least the decency of shame. What I got was worse. He looked at me with something close to relief, and he said, "Okay. So, we both know now." Calm, almost grateful. Like I'd finally read the last page of a book he'd finished a long time ago. I filed for divorce within the month. I did it the way I did everything, carefully, with a folder and a lawyer I could barely afford, a tired, decent woman named who took my retainer and told me that in Ohio, infidelity alone wouldn't change much, that courts cared about children and stability, not who was faithful. Just keep your head down, she told me. Document things. Don't give them anything. I nodded. I thought she meant the divorce. I didn't yet understand there was a different war coming, one she wasn't equipped to fight. Because here is what I learned about the Hales, slowly, in the months that followed. They did not see divorce as an ending. They saw it as a negotiation, and the Hales did not enter negotiations they had not already arranged to win. The first sign was the way the story about me began to change. People I'd known for years started looking at me differently at school pickup. A softness in their faces that wasn't kindness, that was pity dressed as concern. A neighbor asked, gently, if I was getting enough support with everything. A mother I barely knew said she'd heard the night shifts were a lot for Lily. I hadn't told anyone about my schedule. I hadn't told anyone anything. But a narrative was moving through my world ahead of me, and I was always one step behind it, never able to find the source, never able to catch it and say, that isn't true. It was Vivian's voice in all of it. I knew it the way you know a perfume. The phrasing was always the same, never an accusation. Always a worry. I just worry about that child, with her mother gone all night. You cannot fight a worry. You cannot take a worry to court and prove it false. It seeps. And while I was busy being honest, being patient, keeping my head down exactly as my lawyer advised, they were quietly building a portrait of a mother who was never home, never present, never enough. The night shift nurse who left her daughter in the dark. The truth, of course, was the opposite. I had arranged certified overnight care, a licensed sitter with references I'd checked myself, the kind of careful arrangement only a frightened, devoted mother makes. I had the records. I had the receipts. I had the texts confirming every single night. But truth that lives in a folder is silent until someone makes it speak, and I didn't yet know how loud I would one day have to be. The moment I understood the real shape of what was coming arrived on an ordinary afternoon, in Vivian's sitting room, where she'd asked me to come. To talk, woman to woman. She poured tea she knew I wouldn't drink. She let the silence stretch. And then she set her cup down with that precise little click and looked at me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Because it was almost tender. "You're a sensible girl, Natalie," she said. "So I'm going to be sensible with you. Daniel's going to ask for Lily, and he's going to get her. A mother who works all night, no real money of her own, a little house with a broken step. It's not about whether you love her. I'm sure you do, in your way. It's about how it looks, and I have spent 40 years learning exactly how things look to the right people." She smiled. "We've never lost. Not once. I'd hate for you to spend money you don't have learning that the hard way." There it was. Not a threat shouted in anger. A threat poured like tea. It's about how it looks. And I have spent 40 years learning exactly how things look to the right people. She was telling me, plainly, that the outcome was already arranged, that the truth was irrelevant, that I had already lost a fight I didn't know had started. I should have been more frightened than I was. And I was frightened, my hands were cold around that untouched cup. But underneath the fear, something older woke up. The same quiet, stubborn thing that had made me keep every receipt and label every folder. I looked at this elegant woman who had spent her life making cruelty look like grace, and I heard not just a threat but a confession. She had just told me how they would do it, how it looks, appearances, a story, and stories, I understood, can be unwritten by facts, if you have enough of them and the patience to gather more. I drove home in the dark, her words turning over, and somewhere along the way the fear settled into something steadier and colder. That night, after I checked the sitter's confirmation text and kissed Lily's sleeping forehead, I opened my notebook again. I wrote down the date. I wrote down every word Vivian had said, exactly as she'd said it. And then I started a list, in my careful nurse's hand, of everything I had, every record, every receipt, every text, every proof that the story they were telling was a lie. Vivian had told me the family always wins. She was so certain of it that she'd said it to my face, more than once, as if certainty were the same as truth. What she didn't know, what neither of them ever thought to ask, was that the quiet woman they'd decided to erase had never once, in all those years, stopped writing things down. The temporary order didn't come for me all at once. Looking back, I can see now that it arrived in pieces, each one small enough to dismiss, until they assembled into a wall I couldn't climb. That is how it's done, I've learned. Not in a single blow you can point to, but in 100 quiet preparations you only recognize as a trap after it's already closed. In the weeks after that tea, I started noticing things. A car I didn't know parked across from my house in the early mornings when the sitter left and I came home. A woman from Lily's school, friendly in a way that felt rehearsed, asking careful questions about my hours, about who watched Lily, about whether I ever got overwhelmed. I answered honestly, because I had nothing to hide, because I still believed honesty was a shield. I didn't understand I was being interviewed. I didn't understand that my calm, tired answers were being written down and reshaped into something I would not recognize. When the petition finally came, my lawyer called me at work, and I had to step into the supply closet to take it. Surrounded by gauze and saline, my hands going numb, she read me pieces of it in a flat, careful voice, and each piece was a small theft of my own life. They claimed I left Lily, unsupervised overnight on a regular basis. They claimed my home was unstable. They had a statement from a woman, the friendly one from school, describing me as frequently exhausted and emotionally volatile. They had something from a neighbor I barely knew about, frequent unfamiliar cars. At my house, the sitter's car, the very proof of my care, twisted into evidence of chaos. And they had Daniel, the absent father, recast as a steady, present, deeply concerned dad, supported by a respected family, offering Lily a stable home. It was all true, shaped. That's what undid me. Not one outright lie I could hold up and disprove in a sentence, but 100 true facts bent at the wrong angle until they told a false story. Yes, I worked nights. Yes, there were unfamiliar cars. Yes, I was tired. The facts were mine. The story was theirs. And the story is what a judge reads first. I sat in that supply closet, and I understood, finally and completely, what Vivian had meant. It's about how it looks. They hadn't needed to invent a monster. They just needed to stand in good light and let me stand in bad, and trust that a busy court, handed a tidy narrative by people with money and a respected name, would not look too closely at the woman with the broken porch step and no family money and no one important to vouch for her. The order was granted before I ever got to fully tell my side. Temporary, the paper said. Pending review. As if that word, temporary, could undo a single night of my daughter waking in a strange room without me. They handed the Hales physical custody and handed me a date months away, and a presumption of guilt to carry until then. And then they came. On a night they knew I was working, and they emptied her room. You already know what I came home to. What I haven't told you is what came after, because the cruelty of that night wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning of the part where I learned who I really had, and who I only thought I had. I called my family the next morning. My mother, my older sister. I told them, my voice shaking, what had happened, certain that blood would close ranks around me, the way I'd always been told it did. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you everything before the words do. And then my sister said, carefully, well, Nat, you do work an awful lot of nights. My mother said maybe I should think about whether Lily wouldn't be better off somewhere more settled, just for now. I realized, standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, that the Hayles story had reached even here. Vivian's worry had traveled down every wire that should have carried love to me, and turned it lukewarm. I want to be honest about how close I came to believing them. That is the part no one warns you about. When everyone around you, the court, the neighbors, even your own mother, tells you the same gentle, terrible thing, that maybe you really are the problem, maybe your child really is better off without you, it gets very hard to hold on to the truth of yourself. Doubt is a kind of erosion too. For a few days I stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly, sat in my house with all the lights on, and Lily's drawing pressed flat on the table, and I genuinely wondered if I was the woman they'd described. Tired, volatile, not enough. I wondered if fighting would only hurt her more. I wondered if the most loving thing I could do was disappear quietly, the way they so clearly wanted me to. That is exactly what they were counting on. They had not built their case to win a fight. They had built it so I would never start one. What pulled me back was small. It almost always is. I was sorting through a basket of Lily's things they hadn't bothered to take, and I found a voice memo on my phone from months before. Recorded by accident the way children do. Her thumb on the screen. 40 seconds of her humming a song she'd made up, narrating a drawing, calling out, "Mama, look, I made the sun bigger so it's warm enough for both of us." Her voice filled my dark kitchen. And the doubt didn't vanish, but it stopped mattering more than she did. Whatever the court believed, whatever my mother believed, whatever story Vivian had spent 40 years learning to tell, that little girl had reached for the warmth and put me inside it. She was not better off without me. She was simply, quietly, devastatingly without me. And someone had done that on purpose. I stood up in my kitchen at 4 in the morning, and the fear was still there, and the doubt was still there. But underneath them both was something that finally outweighed them. They had taken my child by making me look like a woman too broken and too alone to fight. They had a respected name, money, a network of careful voices, and a court already leaning their way. What they did not have was the truth, and they did not know that I had been keeping it, in folders and receipts and notebooks, all along. They had built a story. I had been quietly collecting the facts that could burn it down. I just didn't yet know how to light the match, or who in the world would ever stand beside me while I did. I would find that out the following week, in a place I'd been too proud and too frightened to walk into. A small, crowded legal aid office, with bad coffee and a long wait, where I would meet the first person in months to look at me, listen to everything, and say the words I had stopped believing I'd ever hear. "I believe you, and I think we can win." I almost didn't go in. I want to tell you that, because pride is a strange thing, and it nearly cost me everything that mattered. I sat in my car outside the legal aid office for 20 minutes, watching people come and go through the glass doors, and every instinct I had told me to drive away. I had always been the one who helped, never the one who needed it. To walk into a free clinic and admit I couldn't afford the lawyer I needed, that the careful, capable woman I'd always been had run out of money and options both, felt like a final humiliation on top of all the others. The Hayles had lawyers in tall buildings. I had a folder on the passenger seat and $40 left in my account. But the folder was the thing that made me open the car door. Because I kept thinking, what is all this paper for, if I'm too proud to put it in front of someone who might know what to do with it? So I went in. I took a number. I sat for 2 hours under fluorescent lights, on a plastic chair, holding that folder against my chest like it was Lily herself, surrounded by other people having the worst days of their lives. And when they finally called me back, I met Ruth. Ruth Alvarez was not what I expected. She was somewhere in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up into gray, streaked hair and a desk buried in files, and she had the kind of tired, direct face that has seen a great deal and decided to keep showing up anyway. She didn't smile at me with pity. She just gestured at the chair and said, "Tell me what happened. Start wherever you want. And don't leave things out because you think they make you look bad. The things you're embarrassed about are usually the things that matter." So I told her. All of it. The marriage, the affair, the divorce, Vivian's tea and her threat, the friendly woman from the school, the petition full of true-shaped lies, the empty room, my mother's lukewarm voice on the phone. I'd been carrying it alone for so long that it came out in a flood, and somewhere in the middle of it I started crying. The kind of crying you do when you finally stop performing strength for a moment. Ruth didn't rush me. She listened the way I listened to frightened parents at 3 a.m, fully, without flinching, writing the occasional note. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she took off her glasses, looked at me, and said the words I had stopped believing anyone would ever say. "I believe you. I've seen this exact thing more times than I can count. Families with money and a good name, they don't fight dirty in ways you can point to. They fight clean and slow, and they let everyone else assume the woman with no money must be the unstable one. It's not your fault you didn't see it coming. It's designed so you don't." I cannot fully explain what those words did to me. For months I had been alone inside a story everyone else seemed to agree on. To have someone, anyone, look at the same facts and see me clearly. It was like surfacing after being underwater longer than your lungs can stand. I think I would have followed Ruth into anything in that moment. But she didn't offer me comfort. She offered me something better. She reached across the desk and tapped my folder. "What's in here?" And this is the part I want you to understand, because it's the part that changed everything. When I opened that folder and started laying things on her desk, Ruth's whole posture changed. The receipts for Lily's clothes and medicine, organized by month, the pediatrician's records with my name on every form, the certified sitter's references, the licensing paperwork I'd checked myself, the text confirming every single overnight, dated and timed. The bank records showing that I, the woman with no money of her own, had been the one paying for my daughter's entire life while the family money sat untouched behind its locked doors. My notebook, with Vivian's words written out exactly as she'd spoken them, dated the day she said them. Ruth went through it slowly, page by page, and when she looked up at me, something in her eyes had sharpened. "Natalie," she said quietly, "do you understand what you have here? They built a story that you're an absent, unstable, broke mother. And you've been documenting the exact opposite in writing for years, without even knowing you'd need it. This isn't a sob story against a respected family. This is a paper trail. Courts don't run on stories. They run on evidence. And right now, you have evidence and they have a performance. I want to be careful here, because I owe you honesty, and Ruth was relentlessly honest with me. She did not promise me an easy victory. She leaned back and told me the truth about how this would actually go. And it was not the truth I wanted. "Here's what you need to understand," she said. "This is going to be slow. The temporary order is in place, and judges don't undo those quickly, because the last thing a court wants is to bounce a child back and forth. We don't get Lily back next week. We build a case for the review hearing, and we build it so airtight that when we walk in, the judge has no honest choice. That means months. That means you keep working, keep documenting. Keep your composure even when they provoke you, especially when they provoke you. The version of you that wants to scream the truth at them in a parking lot, that version loses. The version that quietly hands me one more piece of proof every week, that version wins. Months. The word landed hard. Every cell in my body wanted Lily home that night, and Ruth was telling me to be patient while my daughter slept in another house. But I understood the logic of it. The way I understand that you don't pull a fever down too fast, or you cause more harm than the fever itself. Some healing has to be slow to be real. Some fights have to be slow to be won. "There's one more thing," Ruth said, gathering my papers into a neat stack with a care that told me she already saw it as ours now, not just mine. "Records prove you're a good mother. That's defense. But a family like this, that came after you on purpose, defense might not be enough. To really break their story, we want something that shows their intent. Something in their own words. A motive. People like the Hales believe they're untouchable, and untouchable people get careless, because they've never once had to be careful. Somewhere, sometime, one of them said something they shouldn't have. A message, a voicemail, an email. If anything like that exists, Natalie, it's worth more than every receipt in this folder combined. I told her I'd think hard about it. I told her I'd go through everything. And I drove home that night different than I'd arrived. The fear still there but no longer alone in the car with me. For the first time since that empty room, I had a plan, a person, and a path, slow and narrow as it was. It wasn't until I was lying awake at 2 in the morning, turning Ruth's words over the way I'd turned over Vivian's, that something surfaced from the back of my memory. Daniel, months ago, angry on the phone about money, not knowing I'd let it go to voicemail, not knowing I'd never deleted it. A voicemail I'd saved without ever quite knowing why. I sat up in the dark, my heart suddenly loud, and reached for my phone. The weeks that followed taught me something I had never fully understood about myself. The very habits that the Hales had used to paint me as cold and obsessive. The lists, the folders, the receipts kept long past when anyone would need them, were not the symptoms of a broken woman. They were the architecture of my survival. Vivian had spent 40 years learning how things look. I had spent a lifetime learning how to write down how things actually were. And in a courtroom, Ruth had promised me, the second one wins if you have the patience to build it brick by brick. So I built. Ruth gave me a list, and I worked it the way I work a difficult shift, methodically, refusing to let the size of it overwhelm me. The first task was my schedule. I requested my certified work records from the hospital, the official ones, stamped and signed, showing not chaos, but the opposite, a steady, predictable rotation I had arranged my entire life around. Beside each overnight shift, I laid the matching confirmation from my licensed sitter, the texts where she'd written, "Lily's asleep, all good, see you at 7, dated and timed, dozens of them. A quiet wall of proof that on every single night they'd called me absent, my daughter had been safe, watched, and exactly where I'd carefully placed her. Then came the money. This was the piece that made even Ruth shake her head when I brought it in. The Hales petition had leaned hard on the image of me as a woman with no real resources, dependent, unstable, while Daniel offered the security of family wealth. But I pulled my bank records going back years, and the story they told was the truth turned right side up. It was my account, my nurse's salary, that had paid for Lily's clothes, her doctor's visits, her shoes, her school supplies, her medicine. The Hale money, all that old quiet wealth, had funded Daniel's life and Vivian's luncheons and a wing of a hospital with their name on it. It had never once bought my daughter a winter coat. I had. Line by line, I could prove it. The family that called me the one with nothing was the family that had given Lily nothing at all. I sat at my kitchen table night after night, organizing it the way I'd organize a patient's chart, and slowly the woman in the Hales story dissolved. In her place stood someone they had never bothered to look at. A mother who worked, planned, paid, and protected, who had built a careful life out of very little while they wrote lies about her over expensive tea. Every page I added made me steadier. It is a strange kind of healing, proving to yourself in ink what you'd let other people make you doubt. But Ruth's words stayed with me through all of it. Records prove you're a good mother. That's defense. To break their story, we want something in their own words. And I knew, lying awake, that there was one thing I hadn't looked at yet. The voicemail. I'd remembered it that night in the dark, but I'd been almost afraid to play it, the way you're afraid to reopen a wound, and find it worse than you recalled. It was from months earlier, during the worst of the divorce fighting, back when I still thought we were arguing about money, and not about a child. Daniel had called while I was on shift. I'd let it go to voicemail, and for some reason I had never been able to name, I had never deleted it. It had migrated through phone after phone, a saved message I scrolled past 100 times, a small dark thing I kept without knowing why. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, the house quiet, and I played it. His voice came out low and angry, the public charm stripped completely away, the Daniel almost no one ever heard. "You think this is about Lily," he said. "I don't care where she sleeps, Natalie. This is about the support payments. If I have primary custody, I don't pay you a dime, I get the tax side of it, and my mother gets to stop pretending she respects you. Mom's handling the judge angle. She always does. So do us both a favor and stop fighting something that's already done." I sat very still in the dark. "I don't care where she sleeps. This is about the support payments? Mom's handling the judge angle." 40 seconds of a man admitting, in his own voice, that the loving father in the petition was a fiction, that the entire case for taking my daughter, was about money and pride, and that his mother believed she could reach the court itself. My hands were shaking, but not the way they had on that mattress months ago. This was different. This was the shake of holding something you know is going to matter more than you can yet measure. The cruelty of it should have broken my heart all over again, and part of it did. Hearing my child described as a line item, a tax angle, a thing he didn't care where it slept. But a colder, clearer part of me understood exactly what Ruth had told me I'd need. Intent, motive, in his own words. The proof that this was never about Lily's safety, and always about a man and his mother who had decided I was an inconvenience to be removed. I didn't trust myself to do anything else with it that night. I plugged my phone in, and I left it exactly where it was, and the next morning I drove to Ruth's office and played it for her across her cluttered desk. She listened with her glasses in her hand and her face very still. When it ended, she didn't speak for a long moment. Then she set her glasses down with a care that reminded me, strangely, of Vivian setting down her teacup, except everything behind it was the opposite. "Natalie," she said quietly, "do you understand what you just played for me?" I told her I thought I did. "No," she said. "I don't think you do yet. The records win you the defense. They show you're a fit mother and that their facts are bent. But this shows the court the whole thing was built on a lie about why. A judge can forgive a messy marriage. A judge does not forgive being told by a wealthy family that they plan to handle the judge. This is the difference between us defending you and us ending them." She made me send it to her, properly, and she walked me carefully through how it would be preserved and authenticated so that no one could later claim it was faked or taken out of context. Nothing reckless, nothing leaked, nothing posted in anger. "People like the Hales," she said, "expect you to do something emotional with this. Confront him, threaten him, tip your hand. The moment you do, they adjust. So we do the opposite. We say nothing. We let them keep believing you're beaten and broke and alone. And we walk into that hearing with their own voice in our hands." I drove home that day with the strangest feeling I'd had in months. Lily was still in another house. The fear was still there. But for the first time, I understood that the people who'd been so certain they'd already won had made one mistake. They had been so busy performing for everyone watching that they'd forgotten the quiet woman taking notes. Daniel had called to tell me it was already done. He had no idea he'd just recorded the reason it wasn't. The invitation came on heavy cream-colored paper, hand-addressed in Vivian's elegant slanting script, the kind of stationery that costs more than a week of my groceries. A family dinner, it said, to discuss, moving forward sensibly, for everyone's sake, especially Lily's. I stood in my kitchen holding it, and I almost laughed at the audacity, the sheer practiced grace of it. They had taken my child, built a case of lies, and now they were summoning me to dinner to discuss my surrender over good china, as if civility were a thing they'd ever offered me. I called Ruth before I'd even taken off my coat. I expected her to tell me not to go. Instead, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me. "Go. But understand exactly what this is. They're not inviting you to negotiate. They're inviting you to confirm that you're beaten. Vivian wants to watch you accept it across her own table, because to a woman like that, the surrender matters as much as the win. So go, and let her have the picture she wants. Say nothing about the records. Nothing about the voicemail. Nothing about me, if you can help it. Let them keep believing you're alone and finished. Every minute they underestimate you is a minute they don't prepare. You're not going there to fight, Natalie. You're going there to listen." So that is how I came to be sitting at Vivian Hale's dining table on a Friday evening, in the good dress I'd worn to family gatherings for years, the one she'd once touched between two fingers and called clever. The dining room was exactly as I remembered, the long polished table, the heavy silver, the portrait of Daniel's late father presiding over it all. Candles, fresh flowers. The performance of a warm family, staged for an audience of one woman they intended to break. Daniel was there, of course, relaxed and golden in his chair, that easy smile back in place now that the cold voice from the voicemail had been safely tucked away where he thought no one would ever hear it. He poured wine he knew I wouldn't drink. He asked about my work with a tenderness so convincing that if I hadn't heard him call our daughter a tax angle, I might have wavered. That was the most frightening thing about Daniel, even then. He could perform the loving man so completely that he half believed it himself. And Vivian presided. She let the meal unfold gently, all soft conversation and gracious hosting, before she finally set down her fork and turned to me with that tender, terrible expression I knew so well. "Natalie, dear," she said, "I'm so glad you came. I think it's time we were honest with each other as women. You've fought hard. No one can say you didn't. But you have to see how this ends. A long, ugly battle that drains what little you have, that drags Lily through years of uncertainty. Or a sensible arrangement. Supervised visits to start. A clean break for everyone. You'd still see her. You'd just stop pretending you can win a war against this family. I want you to know how much was in me in that moment. Everything in my body wanted to reach into my bag, pull out the truth, and lay it on her beautiful table. Instead, I did what Ruth had told me. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked down at my plate. I let my shoulders drop, let my face go tired and uncertain, and I gave Vivian the picture she'd invited me there to see. A defeated woman, considering it. "I don't know," I said quietly. "I'm so tired. I just want what's best for her." And I watched something flicker across Vivian's face, satisfaction, the small private pleasure of a woman who has never lost and is about to win again. She thought she was watching me break. She was watching me listen. Because here is what arrogance does to people who have never been held accountable. It makes them careless. Vivian, certain she'd won, relaxed in a way I'd never seen. She poured herself more wine. She grew expansive, almost confiding, the way the powerful become when they believe they're among the safely defeated. And she said the thing I will be grateful for until the day I die. "You know, Natalie," she said, swirling her glass, "people think these things are decided by who's right. They're not. They're decided by who's known. I've sat on the foundation board with half the people who matter in this county for 30 years. I funded the new courthouse atrium. Did you know that? My late husband's name is on a plaque in that very building. Judges remember who their friends are. That's not corruption, dear. That's just how the world works for people who've earned their place in it." She smiled. "You never stood a chance, and I think it's a kindness that you're finally seeing it." I kept my face still. I kept my hands folded. But inside, every word was being written down in the careful hand I'd been using for months. As judges remember who their friends are. I funded the new courthouse atrium. She had just told me at her own table that she believed she could influence the court, the exact thing Daniel's voicemail had claimed. Two voices now, mother and son, saying the same buried truth. And then I noticed something I almost missed. At the far end of the table sat a woman I'd barely spoken to in all my years in this family, Daniel's younger sister, Claire, the forgotten one. The disappointment, Vivian called her when she thought no one was listening, the daughter who'd never married well or smiled enough or learned how things look. Claire had said almost nothing all evening. But when Vivian spoke about the courthouse and the judges and the plaque, I saw Claire's fork go still against her plate. I saw her glance up, just for a second, and look not at her mother but at me. And in that single look there was something I recognized instantly, because I'd seen it in my own mirror for years. The quiet, contained recognition of someone who has spent a lifetime watching this family smile while it cuts. The moment passed. Vivian moved on, gracious again, certain the evening had gone exactly as she'd planned. I thanked them for dinner. I said I'd think about the arrangement. I let Daniel walk me to the door with his hand warm and false on my shoulder. And I drove home in the dark with my heart pounding and Vivian's words echoing. And underneath them, that single still look from the end of the table. I wrote everything down before I'd even taken off my coat. Every word Vivian had said, dated, timed. And at the bottom of the page, almost without deciding to, I wrote one more line. Claire heard it too. And Claire looked at me like she'd been waiting years for someone to finally tell the truth. I didn't know yet what to do with that. But 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and a voice I'd barely ever heard said, very quietly, "Natalie, it's Claire, Daniel's sister. I think we need to talk, and I'd rather my mother never knew that we did." We met in a small coffee shop on the other side of town, the kind of place where no one Vivian knew would ever set foot, and Claire arrived 10 minutes early and sat with her back to the door, as if she were the one with something to hide. I almost didn't recognize her out from under the weight of that house. At family gatherings she had always seemed to fold herself smaller, to disappear into the wallpaper while her mother and brother filled the room. Here, across a chipped table with her hands wrapped around a coffee she didn't drink, she just looked like a tired woman who had carried something heavy for a very long time. "I have to tell you something," she said, before I'd even sat down properly. And once I do, I can't take it back, and they'll never forgive me. So let me say it before I lose my nerve. She took a breath. I know what they did to you. I know it was a lie. And I've known for longer than I can stand. I stayed quiet and let her talk. The way Ruth had taught me. The way I'd learned at 100 bedsides. And it came out of Claire the way it had once come out of me in Ruth's office. In a flood that had clearly been dammed up for years. She told me she'd grown up the other child in that house. Not the golden one. The useful disappointment, the daughter trotted out when convenient and dismissed the rest of the time. Measured always against Daniel and always found wanting. You and I, she said, with a small broken laugh, were the same to them. Things that are supposed to be grateful. I watched them do to you exactly what they'd been doing to me my whole life, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and I was a coward. She looked up at me. I'm done being a coward. Then she told me the thing that changed everything. The friendly woman from Lily's school. The one whose statement called me exhausted and emotionally volatile. The one whose careful questions I'd answered so honestly. Claire knew her. She was a friend of the family, coached by Daniel himself. I was in the house, Claire said, her voice dropping even though no one was near us. I heard him going over it with her, telling her what words to use. Say volatile. Say you're concerned for the child. Don't say anything you can't walk back. He fed her every line, Natalie. And then they got her to sign it like it was her own worry. She pressed her hands flat against the table. It wasn't a witness, it was a script. And I heard him write it. I sat very still. For months I had known the statement was false, had felt the wrongness of it without being able to prove the rot at its root. And here, across a chipped table, was the one person in the world who had stood in the room and watched the lie be built. Not a record I could produce, not a document I could enter, a witness, a hail, someone the court could not dismiss as a bitter ex-wife with a grudge, because she was their own blood, choosing the truth over her family at enormous cost to herself. Claire, I said carefully. Do you understand what it would mean to say that to a judge? Under oath. They will turn on you completely. Everything you have with them, it ends. She gave me a long look, and something in her face settled, the way mine had settled on that kitchen floor at 4 a.m. What I have with them, she said quietly, was never worth keeping. I've spent 40 years being family to people who only ever loved what I was useful for. You know exactly what that feels like. I watched them do it to you. And I watched them try to take a child to do it. And I can't sit at one more dinner pretending I didn't hear what I heard. She wrapped her hands tighter around the cold coffee. Let them turn on me. At least I'll finally be on the right side of something. I told her about Ruth then, carefully, because trust is a fragile thing and I was learning to protect it. And a few days later, the two of us sat in that cluttered legal aid office while Claire told Ruth everything she'd told me. And I watched Ruth's whole posture change again the way it had over the voicemail. When Claire finished, Ruth set down her pen and looked at the two of us across her desk. The night shift nurse and the forgotten daughter, two women a powerful family had decided didn't matter. All right, she said quietly. I want to be honest with both of you about where we are now, because you deserve to understand it. She laid it out the way she did everything, plainly. The records, she said, proved I was a fit and devoted mother, and that the Hales facts were bent. That was the foundation. The voicemail proved Daniel's true motive, that the loving father was a fiction, and the whole case was about money and pride. And now Claire's testimony proved the petition itself was fabricated, coached, a manufactured witness fed her lines by the very man claiming to act for his daughter's welfare. Defense, motive, and fabrication? Ruth said. A month ago you had a sympathetic story and a stack of receipts. Now you have a case. Then she told us what she intended to do, and how and why it would take the shape it did. She would not ambush anyone in the press or post anything in anger. She would file a motion for an emergency review of the custody order, on the grounds of newly discovered evidence and material misrepresentation to the court. She would request that Vivian's claimed influence be examined, carefully, properly, not as a wild accusation, but as a documented pattern in the family's own words. She walked us through the timeline, weeks, not days, the way these things move when they move correctly, and she warned us both, again, that the hardest part was still ahead. They don't know any of this is coming, she said. They think Natalie is at her table deciding how gracefully to lose. We are going to let them keep thinking that right up until we walk into that hearing. Which means from now until then, both of you say nothing. You change nothing. You give them no reason to prepare. Can you do that? We said we could. And we did. Through the long, quiet weeks of preparation, Claire and I became something I hadn't expected and hadn't known I needed. Not co-conspirators exactly, but something older and warmer, two people who had each spent a lifetime being the family scapegoat, finding in each other the thing the Hales had never given either of us. Someone who simply believed us, without needing to be convinced. She would call late at night when the guilt of betraying her own blood crept in, and I would remind her, gently, that you cannot betray people who never offered you loyalty in the first place. She, in turn, reminded me on the nights I missed Lily so badly I couldn't breathe, that I was almost there, that the truth was finally heavier than their story. The morning Ruth filed the motion, she called me at home. "It's done," she said. "It's in front of the court, the hearing's set." She paused. "Natalie, I've done this a long time. They are going to walk into that room absolutely certain they've already won. They have no idea what's waiting." I stood in my kitchen, Lily's crayon drawing taped now to the cabinet in front of me, the fat yellow sun, the two of us holding hands. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of the next time I'd see Daniel and Vivian. I'd see them in a courtroom. And this time, I would be the one holding the truth. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. I think some part of me had built it up into something vast and cathedral, like a place grand enough to match the size of what would be decided in it. But it was an ordinary room, wood-paneled and a little worn, with fluorescent lights and a flag in the corner, and a clock on the wall that ticked loud enough to hear in the silences. I remember thinking that it was strange, that the most important hours of my life would happen in a room that looked like a place you'd renew a license. Daniel and Vivian arrived the way they entered, everything, as if the room had been waiting for them. He wore a dark, tasteful suit and the wounded, dignified expression of a father, carrying a heavy burden with grace. She wore pearls and her courtroom face, gracious and composed, nodding at the clerk, murmuring something to their lawyer that made him smile. Their attorney was exactly what their money could buy, polished, expensive, certain. They had brought witnesses, they had brought presents. They had brought 40 years of knowing how things look. And when Vivian's eyes found me across the room, sitting in my plain dress beside a tired legal aid lawyer with a single banker's box of files, she gave me a small, almost pitying smile. "You never stood a chance." She didn't have to say it. She'd already said it at her own table. I let her have the smile. I'd learned, by then, the power of letting people believe they've won. Their lawyer went first, and he was good. He stood and painted the picture they'd been building for the better part of a year, smooth and reasonable and devastating. A loving father offering stability and family support. A mother who, through no great fault of her own, simply couldn't provide the same, gone all night alone, overwhelmed, well, meaning but unequal to the task. He had Daniel take the stand, and Daniel was magnificent, I'll give him that. He spoke about Lily with a catch in his voice. He said he hadn't wanted any of this, that it broke his heart, that he only wanted what was best for his little girl. He looked at the judge with clear, honest eyes and called himself a father, doing the hardest thing a father can do. I watched a man who had called our daughter a tax angle weep gently about her future, and I understood, finally and completely, that he had never once meant any of it, and that he was very, very good at this. The judge, a calm woman in her 60s with reading glasses and a careful, unreadable face, listened to all of it without expression. And I felt the room lean, the way I'd feared it would, toward the family with the name and the money and the practiced grief. Then Ruth stood up. She didn't raise her voice, she never did. She walked to the center of that small room with her worn folder and said, simply, that the court had been given a story, and that she was going to give it some facts. And then, piece by careful piece, she began to take their story apart. She started with the records, and I watched the room change. She entered my certified work schedule, steady and predictable, and beside it the dozens of dated, time confirmations from my licensed sitter, every overnight accounted for. She entered the pediatrician's records with my name on every form, the school paperwork, the proof of who actually showed up for the dull, sacred work of raising a child. Then she entered the bank statements, and I saw the judge's eyebrow lift, just slightly, as Ruth walked her line by line through the truth, that the woman called penniless and unstable had personally paid for every coat, Every doctor's visit, every shoe, while the celebrated family wealth had bought luncheons and a plaque, and never once a thing for the child it claimed to want to protect. The picture they had painted of me began, quietly, to dissolve in front of everyone. Daniel's lawyer objected twice. The judge let it all in. I watched Vivian's composure tighten by a single degree, just enough that I, who had spent years learning to read her, could see it. Then Ruth called Claire. I will never forget the sound the room made when Claire Hale stood up from the gallery and walked to the stand to testify against her own family. It wasn't a gasp, it was a kind of stillness, a held breath. Daniel's head turned sharply. Vivian went very, very still. Their lawyer leaned to whisper urgently, but there was nothing to whisper, because no amount of money prepares you for your own daughter choosing the truth. Claire was pale and her hands shook, but her voice, when she spoke, did not. She told the court she had been in her mother's house and heard her brother coach the school witness, line by line, word by word. She said the statement that called me volatile was not a worry. It was a script. She said it plainly, looking at the judge, and then she looked at me, and I saw 40 years of being the forgotten daughter turn, in that moment, into something none of them could ever take from her again. Their lawyer tried. He went after her hard, suggested she was bitter, estranged, unreliable, and Claire just said, quietly, I have everything to lose by being here and nothing to gain. You should ask yourself why I'd do that. The judge wrote something down. The room had stopped leaning. And then Ruth said the words I had waited months to hear in that room. Your Honor, I'd like to enter one final piece of evidence. A voicemail, left by the petitioner, preserved and authenticated. I'd ask the court's permission to play it. Daniel's face changed. I watched it happen in real time, the wounded father draining away, replaced by something pale and rigid as he realized he didn't know which voicemail, didn't know what he'd said, didn't know what was about to fill that quiet room. The judge nodded. Ruth pressed play, and Daniel's own voice came out into the silence, low and angry and stripped of every ounce of charm. But you think this is about Lily? I don't care where she sleeps. Natalie, this is about the support payments. Mom's handling the judge angle. She always does. I have never heard a room go so silent. The clock on the wall was the loudest thing in it. Daniel sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, every careful tear he'd shed now exposed as the performance it had always been, in his own voice, in his own words. The judge set down her pen and looked at him over her glasses with an expression I can only describe as cold. And then Vivian made the mistake that finished it. Because women who have never once been held accountable do not know how to sit still while the ground opens. She came half out of her seat and said, sharp and imperious, Your Honor, this is absurd. You cannot possibly take a recording out of context. I have known the people in this building for 30 years, and I will not sit here and her own lawyer grabbed her arm too late, because everyone had heard it. Sarah, I have known the people in this building for 30 years. The voicemail had said, Mom's handling the judge angle. And here was Mom, in open court, reaching for exactly that, in front of the judge she'd believed was a friend. The judge looked at Vivian for a long, terrible moment. Then she looked at me, the quiet woman in the plain dress who hadn't said a word, and something in her face had decided. I think. The judge said slowly, I've heard enough to know this order was built on a foundation that does not survive contact with the truth. And in the silence that followed, I finally let myself breathe. The judge called a brief recess, and those 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat on a hard bench in the hallway with Ruth on one side and Claire on the other, the three of us not speaking, because there was nothing left to say that the room hadn't already heard. Through the doors I could see Vivian and Daniel and their expensive lawyer clustered together, and for the first time in all the years I'd known them, the performance was gone. Vivian wasn't gracious. Daniel wasn't charming. They were two people whispering urgently to a man who kept shaking his head, and I understood that the lawyer was no longer telling them how to win. He was telling them how much they were going to lose. When we were called back in, the judge took her seat, folded her hands and looked out over that small worn room. She did not look at Vivian or Daniel. She looked at me. In matters of custody, she began, this court's only concern is the welfare of the child. Not the wealth of a family, not the reputation of a name. The welfare of the child. She let that settle. I have been presented with a temporary order that, I now understand, was obtained on the basis of a statement that was coached and fabricated, A characterization of the mother that the documentary evidence directly contradicts, and a stated motive, in the petitioner's own recorded words, that has nothing whatsoever to do with this child's well-being. Her voice never rose, and that made it worse for them, the way Ruth's never rising had. I find that the existing order cannot stand. I heard Claire's breath catch beside me. I gripped the edge of the bench so hard my knuckles ached. The judge restored primary custody to me, effective immediately. She granted Daniel supervised visitation only, to be reviewed, citing his own recorded statements as grounds for serious concern about his motives and candor. And then she did something I had not dared to hope for. She stated, on the record, that the apparent fabrication of evidence and the petitioner's recorded reference to influencing the court were matters she could not, and would not ignore, and that she was referring the conduct of both the petitioner and the manufactured witness for further review, and noting Vivian Hale's statements in open court for the record. The words were measured and legal and devastating. In plain terms, the lies they'd told a court were now the court's business, and the court was not in a forgiving mood. I didn't cheer. I didn't even smile. After everything, what came was quieter than that. My eyes filled and spilled over, and I put my hand over my mouth and just breathed, because somewhere across the city my daughter was about to be told she was coming home, and I was the one who would tell her. Ruth's hand closed over my shoulder. You did this, she said quietly. You kept every receipt when nobody was watching. You held that voicemail. You walked into that dinner and said nothing. This is yours. But I knew it wasn't only mine, and I reached over and took Claire's shaking hand. The forgotten daughter who had set fire to her own place in that family so a child she barely knew could go home to her mother. I want to tell you what it cost them, because I know you've been waiting to hear it, and because I think those of you who have ever been the useful one, the disposable one, deserve to hear how it ended for the people who were so certain they'd never answer for anything. Daniel's recorded admission did not stay in that room. It couldn't. A man who lies to a court in a sworn proceeding has exposed himself to consequences far beyond a custody ruling, and the referral the judge ordered set those wheels turning slowly and inevitably. The coached witness, faced with Claire's testimony and the prospect of her own liability, did exactly what frightened people do when the protection of a powerful family evaporates. She recanted. She admitted in writing that she'd been told what to say, and once she did, the careful structure of lies the Hales had built didn't just fall, it collapsed inward, taking Daniel's credibility and his polished reputation down with it. But it was Vivian who lost the most, and there is a justice in that I still turn over sometimes late at night. Because Vivian's entire life was built on one thing, the thing she'd valued above her own children, above the truth, above a little girl's right to her mother. Her name. The respected, gracious plaque on the wall name. And in a single afternoon in open court, in front of the very people whose regard she'd spent 40 years cultivating, she had reached for her influence and been heard doing it. The story traveled, the way stories do in a county where everyone knows everyone. The foundation board grew quiet around her. The careful friends became unavailable. The woman who had spent her life learning exactly how things looked discovered, far too late, how she looked now. Not powerful, not untouchable. Just a wealthy woman who had tried to take a child from a good mother to save her son some money, and gotten caught doing it in her own words. I never had to lift a finger to punish them. I want you to understand that, because for so long I'd imagined revenge as something loud, something I would have to chase. It wasn't. I simply told the truth, slowly and carefully, and let it be heavy enough to fall on its own. Their cruelty had always depended on no one looking too closely. The moment someone did, with proof in her hand, the whole thing came apart under its own weight. That is the quietest, most complete kind of justice there is. They built the weapon. I only made sure the right people finally heard it go off. Daniel left the courthouse that day without his charm, without his story, and without the daughter he'd never really wanted, only wanted to take. Vivian left without the one thing she'd valued more than any of us. And I left with a court order in my hand that said, in the language of the law that I had once foolishly trusted and had now finally learned to use, that Lily Brooks belonged with her mother. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot afterward, the engine off, the order on the seat beside me where the folder used to ride, and I let myself shake for a long moment, all the months of held together fear finally loosening. Then I wiped my face, and I started the car, Because there was only one thing left in the world I wanted to do, and I had waited so long to do it. I was going to go bring my daughter home. I had imagined the moment so many times during those long months that I was almost afraid the real thing couldn't survive it. I'd pictured it on the drive to work, in the dark of the night shifts, lying awake in a house too quiet without her. I'd built it up into something enormous. And then it happened, and it was not enormous at all. It was small and quiet, and it broke me open more completely than anything had in my life. They brought her out to me, and for a second she just stood there, in a coat I didn't recognize, holding the stuffed rabbit they'd taken from her shelf, looking at me the careful way children look when they've learned that the adults around them can't always be trusted to mean what they say. That look nearly killed me. My daughter, my Lily, who used to reach for my hand in parking lots without even checking it would be there, had learned in those months to hesitate, to brace, to wonder. I knelt down on the pavement so I'd be small too, and I didn't rush her. "Hi, baby," I said. "I came to take you home." And I watched it move across her face, the disbelief, then the understanding, then the thing underneath it all. And she dropped the rabbit and ran the 3 steps into my arms and held on the way you hold on to something you'd been told you'd lost. She didn't cry loudly. She just pressed her face into my neck and shook, and whispered, "I knew you'd come, I told them you'd come." And I held my child on a stretch of cold pavement, and understood that whatever it had cost, whatever it had taken, I would have paid it 1,000 times over for this exact 30 seconds. The drive home, she didn't let go of my hand. Not once. She reached across the gap between the seats and held on, the way she used to before she learned to be afraid, and I drove the whole way one-handed. And I would not have traded that grip for anything in the world. The house was the same crooked little house with the broken porch step I'd never gotten around to fixing, the one Vivian had used as evidence that I had nothing. But when I unlocked the door and Lily ran inside ahead of me, straight up to her room where I'd put everything back, the bed made, the nightlight plugged in and glowing, the rabbit's spot waiting on the shelf, she stopped in the doorway and just looked at it. Then she turned around and looked at me, and she said, "You kept it the same." And I realized that to her, that was the whole world. That through everything, the place that was hers had stayed hers. That someone had held it for her. I had been so busy fighting that I hadn't understood the keeping was its own kind of love, the quiet daily devotion that the Hales had never once managed and never would. I want to be honest with you about the healing, because I think the stories that pretend it's instant do a disservice to anyone who's actually lived through something like this. It was not instant. Lily had nightmares for a while. She'd wake and call out, and need to know I was still in the house. And I'd sit on the edge of her bed in the dark until she drifted off again, and I never once minded, because being needed at 3 a.m. by my own child was the privilege they had tried to take from me. Slowly the hesitation left her. Slowly, she stopped bracing. Slowly, she reached for my hand again without checking. Children heal in their own time if you simply stay, and stay and stay. So I stayed, and I changed some things. I spoke with the hospital, and shifted to a schedule that let me be home at bedtime. Not because the night shifts had ever made me a bad mother. The records had proven that they hadn't. But because I'd earned the right to choose. And I chose her. Money was tighter without Daniel's grudging support. And I'll tell you plainly it was hard some months. But it was a clean kind of hard. The crooked house was paid for with my own work, and free of anyone who'd ever made me feel small in it. And I had learned, finally, that a home without cruelty is worth more than a mansion full of it. The family I'd been born into came back, eventually. My mother, my sister, sheepish and humbled, having watched the truth come out and understood, far too late, that they'd let Vivian's worry curdle their own love into doubt. I didn't slam the door on them. But I didn't fling it open either. I let them back in slowly, on my terms, the way you let light into a room you've finally made safe. And I watched carefully to see if they'd learned that I was someone to be loved and not just someone to be doubted. Some of them had. Some of them, I'm still not sure. I've made my peace with not being sure. But the family that mattered most, in the end, was the one I chose. Ruth, who had believed me across a cluttered desk when no one else would, became something far more than my lawyer. She'd call to check on Lily. She came to her birthday. And Claire, the forgotten daughter who had burned down her own place in that house for a child she barely knew, Claire became my sister, in every way that the word actually means. We had both spent our whole lives being the useful one, the disposable one. The one they kept around for what we could give and never for who we were. And we found in each other, at last, the thing neither of our families had ever offered. To be believed without having to prove it. To be loved without having to earn it. To be family not by blood but by choice. Lily calls her Aunt Claire now. The two of them garden together in my small crooked yard on Sunday afternoons, and sometimes I stand at the kitchen window watching them, the woman her family threw away, and the child her father tried to take, laughing in the sun, and I have to put my hand on the counter, because the fullness of it is almost too much to hold. I learned something through all of it that I want to leave with you before I tell you the last of it. Family is not the people who happen to share your blood. Family is not the people who smile at you across a holiday table while they sharpen the knife. Family is who shows up when the lights go dark. It's the lawyer who works for free and stays late. It's the sister-in-law who chooses you over her own name. It's the child who whispers, "I knew you'd come," into your neck on a cold parking lot. That is family. The rest was only ever a costume that some people wear over their teeth. I tucked Lily in that first night home, and her nightlight glowed in the corner just where it always had. And she looked up at me with her eyes already heavy and said, "Are you going to be here when I wake up?" "Yes," I told her. "I'm always going to be here when you wake up." And for the first time in longer than I could remember, it was a promise I knew with everything in me that no one on this earth could ever take from me again. It's been a while now since that day in the courtroom, long enough that the fear has stopped living in my body. Long enough that Lily reaches for my hand without ever checking it'll be there. And I've had time to sit with all of it, on the quiet nights after she's asleep, and to ask myself what I actually learned from the worst year of my life. Because I think, if you've stayed with me this long, you didn't come only for the ending. You came because some part of this is your story too. So here is what I know now, that I didn't know on that stripped mattress. I believed, for most of my life, that if I was good enough, useful enough, patient enough, the people who were supposed to love me would finally see me, and the world would keep me safe in return. That was a beautiful thing to believe. It was also a lie, and it nearly cost me my daughter. The truth doesn't protect you on its own. Goodness doesn't protect you on its own. You have to be willing to stand up, quietly and with proof in your hand, and refuse to disappear the way they're counting on you to. Dignity isn't staying silent and hoping to be noticed. Dignity is knowing exactly who you are and being patient enough to let the truth do its slow, heavy work. I learned that the loudest revenge isn't the strongest one. I never screamed at Daniel. I never humiliated Vivian in the street. I simply kept the receipts, saved the voicemail, and walked into that dinner and said nothing at all. I let people who had never been held accountable keep believing they never would be. Right up until the moment the truth fell on them under its own weight. The calmest person in the room is very often the one holding the match. And I learned, most of all, what family really is. Not the blood that shares your name. The people who show up when the lights go dark. Before I let you go, I want to talk to you for a moment, the way I did at the very beginning, because you've been with me through all of it, and I don't want to just close the door. Tell me honestly, how did this story sit with you? Did the ending feel like justice, or did some part of you wish the Hales had paid even more than they did? I genuinely want to know, because I go back and forth on it myself. And tell me where you're listening from tonight: the United States, Canada, the UK, South Africa, the Philippines, Nigeria, Australia, somewhere I've never been. I read your comments, I really do. So many of you have written your own stories under videos like this, about the family that loved what you could give and forgot who you were. And I want you to know that every time I read one, I see you. You are not the useful one. You are not the disposable one. You never were. If you've ever been treated the way I was, treated like the person everyone needed but no one truly cherished, write your country and a little of your story below. Let the others see they're not alone, the way you've maybe felt a little less alone tonight. And if this story reached something in you, stay with me. Subscribe so the next one finds you. Because there's always another story of someone who was underestimated, who was quiet, who was counted out, and who turned out to be holding the truth the whole time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying to the end. Go hold the people who actually show up for you a little tighter tonight. And remember, the quiet ones are not weak. We are simply patient. And patience, with the truth on your side, is the most powerful thing in the world. I'll see you in the next story.